day, everybody, and thank you for joining our webinar, Mastering the New Multi-Interventional ETD in GRADEpro, What's Changed and Why It Matters. My name is Kirsty Watson, and I am the lead business developer here at Evidence Prime, and I will be the host of today's webinar. This webinar will be divided into 3 parts. Firstly, Jessica Beltran will discuss the methodological insights of the new multi-interventional ETD. Then Justina will take us through a hands-on technical application within GRADEpro. And lastly, we have an example of a multi-interventional ETD in a real guideline presented by Dr. Itziar Etxeandia. And then lastly, before we get into the webinar, Evidence Prime will also be attending S4 EU next month. If you like, you can schedule a meeting to meet us in person, or if you like, you can just pop by our booth 113 or 113. Okay, great. So let me introduce our guest speakers. So first we have Jessica Beltran, who is a researcher at the Cochrane Ibero-Americano Center and the GRADE Center in Barcelona. And she is currently pursuing a PhD in biomedical research methodology and public health. Thank you so much for joining us today. And next we have Dr. Itziar Etxeandia, who is a senior scientist at the American College of Physicians Clinical Guideline Program, where she provides scientific and methodological oversight to the development of ACP clinical guidelines. And thank you both to you so much for joining us today. I will now be passing it over to Jessica.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. Hello, everybody. My name is Jessica Beltran, as I said, and I am presenting today with Itzi a brief summary of the multiple comparison ETD framework, what it is and why we built it, and how it supports clearer, more consistent decisions when there are many options on the table. And of course, we present this on behalf of the GRADE ETD project group, especially of the group of multiple intervention comparisons. So we have no actual or potential conflict of interest in relation to this presentation. However, we are both members of the GRADE working group, and I am a member of the Barcelona GRADE Center and Itzi of the ACP GRADE Center. So the GRADE multiple comparison ETD framework enables interest holders to make evidence-based choices among multiple competing options. The multiple comparison ETD evaluates multiple interventions at once, structures synthesis of complex evidence, and supports transparent, consistent decisions across interventions. It is based on previous GRADE work, so we follow all the GRADE guidance from previous publications of the group, but with specific modifications for evaluating multiple comparisons. The multiple intervention comparison ETD framework retains the original ETD 3 core sections, which are the question, assessment, and conclusions, but with a few new features that we will explain briefly. So let's start with the questions section and briefly review the adaptations. So here, the central question is whether and which of the multiple interventions are preferred for a given health problem and population. The PICO components are described in this section, the population and interventions of interest and comparators. Of course, this framework is flexible as it can handle evidence that comes, for example, from an NMA, but also from several systematic reviews with a common comparator, but also several systematic reviews without a common comparator. And we are going to see how this can be done later on with the examples. Then we have bring up to this section the outcomes, the prioritized outcomes, but also the outcomes importance that can be described as health utility values or health utility values. And also, we suggest that the panels decide a priori on magnitude of effect thresholds that can be described in this section before they get to analyze or evaluate and interpret the evidence of effects. Now, we have the assessment section. Here in the assessment section, we have all these domains that you can see here. But remember that the EtD is a flexible framework also in the sense that the panels can prioritize those domains that apply better to their own context. So you can use either less domains than that are depicted here or more domains. For example, the new domain of planetary health can easily be added here. Now, let's see an example of a domain. We can see here the desirable effects that answers the question of how substantial are the desirable anticipated effects of an intervention. Here we see the judgment subsection, the research evidence subsection, and the additional consideration section as always. In the research section, we see that we have a summary of the effects, the relative effects and the absolute effect for each of the interventions and for each of the outcomes. Then in the judgment section, we can list the interventions according to the judgment that the panel made. But to make this process easier, we now use this multiple judgment grid, which enables us to, for example, since we have thresholds now and we have the absolute effect, we can easily interpret, and this can be a semi-automated process, we can easily interpret the effect using the thresholds and to know if this is a small, large, or a large desirable effect, as we can see here. And then then we have a semi-automatized judgment that can be validated by the panel. This can help the panel to handle a large amount of information and can make the process a little bit more faster. Then we have this new domain that it's called the net effect. The net effect evaluates the relationship between the desirable and the undesirable health effect for each of the interventions, as we can see here. It goes from the large net desirable to the large net undesirable. As we can see here, for example, for the interferon, we have moderate desirable effects and small undesirable effects. So most likely panels would say that this is a small net desirable effect. And this net effect then is useful because for two reasons mainly, because we have to handle a large quantity of information, and second, because it gives us more granularity. For example, see here, we have 3 interventions that when we assess the balance of effect, the 3 of them favors the intervention. But if we see the relationship between the desirable and the undesirable effects and calculate the net effect, we can see more granularity for our judgments and make a relative evaluation among the interventions. Then we have the multiple comparison summary of judgments. Here, as you can see, we have in the first column all the domains that have been judged by the panel for each of the interventions in the following column. This helps us to do a judgment about which type of recommendations will be given for each of the interventions. Here in this case, we see that they are all conditional in favor, but as we know, this can be strong or conditional in favor or against, right? The thing is that with this first categorization, we can make clusters and then our recommendations will follow these clusters. After we have done this, now we can make a relative comparison of among the interventions to see which one are the most preferred or the least preferred across interventions. So here, for example, we see that although all of these interventions were going to be conditionally in favor recommended, we have different order of preference for some interventions. This relative comparison then can be presented in different ways. It can be presented using the grade language, or it can be represented by graphicals, as in this example. This was a tuberculosis guideline where we can see modes of ventilation, 4 modes of ventilations, and they were evaluated, and their order of preference was depicted using stars. To conclude, we have in the conclusions, we formulate the recommendations following the same groups that we usually do, strong or conditionally against or in favor. And as we can see in this example, we can even within these groups make state an order of preferences among interventions. And this is how we more or less we have conceptualized the use of this framework. So now, Justina, the floor is over for you.
Yes, thank you very much, Jessica. And now let me share the screen. So as Jessica was presenting to you, the GRADE working group came up with a multiple comparison version of the EtD, and naturally, of course, we wanted to reflect that in GRADEpro, and that's how the multiple comparison question came to be. You can also came across you might have come across the overarching question terminology back in the past, but that's what we are naming it now, and that's what you can do in GRADEpro. So I will show you how you can create it, how it works, and how you can use other GRADEpro features to make sure that this is used to the best of ability, and to make the process as swift as possible. In GRADEpro, the multiple comparison questions are presented in yellow with the crown next to them to show that they are somehow over the regular pairwise questions, in a way perhaps summarizing them for better judgment. They can be added with a multiple comparison question button, which we will now do to show you what it looks like. When I click on this button, what I see is the screen when I can define the parts of the question itself. First of all comes the title of the question, and unlike the pairwise questions, it is not limited to a constant pattern of should intervention versus comparison be used for health problem or population, because, well, it can follow multiple interventions and across various populations and outcomes. So we wanted to give some freedom of naming that question, so you can have it anything. I will use an example from a diabetes guideline by ACP that Itzi will also be presenting on afterwards. And so the question was, what's the what's the effectiveness and harms of newer therapies for type 2 diabetes, and interventions which were considered in that particular project were as follows. And you can add interventions simply by adding buttons, by adding them with a button. You can add basically as many interventions as you want. Of course, there comes a time when it becomes perhaps not practical. You could technically add 100, but certainly you wouldn't be able to discuss them with the panel. So practicality is the only real limit here. You can add a single comparison, which can be either placebo or usual care, or a mix of both, as you can see, or a particular treatment if you want. And of course, the population. So in this case, that would be type 2 diabetes. And again, I can say outcomes. So in this case, let's say it's all-cause mortality and MACE, as was in the project. There are additional aspects I can define, such as setting the authors of this particular recommendation, especially if I want to publish it later on, and other important matters, such as, for example, conflicts of interest. I will not be setting those now to save time, but those are possible for setting, and then I just need to create, and I will be automatically transferred into evidence decision framework for multiple interventions, which looks on, when you look at it first, it looks basically identically to a regular EtD in GRADEpro. It has 3 columns, one for research evidence, one for judgments, and one for additional considerations. It is divided into criteria. So that's basically a regular EtD. The difference comes when you go to further judgments, because then you don't see the radio buttons that you know from regular EtD. Here, as judgment is done for multiple interventions simultaneously, it is a bit more complex. So you have a separate judgment window that opens, and I can see, for example, in case of desirable effects, the benefits, I can see all relevant details I may want to assess. So I see of course, the interventions I'm assessing, and I can see also the outcomes I'm assessing and the overall judgment. What your approach depends of you. So you may decide to just do the overall judgment of benefits for each intervention, of course, on the grade scale from trivial to large, and you can do that. You can do that just overall for each intervention if that's more practical for you. But it is also possible to make assessments for particular outcomes first, so that I can say that in case of all-cause mortality, perhaps GLP-1 has a trivial anticipated desirable effects, and for example, small in MACE. I'm just, of course, making those up. I'm not the specialist behind this guideline. It's Itzi who will show you the real life example, and then afterwards I can decide what's the final judgment. So that's up to you. In the later on, we also want to automate this step using decision thresholds, but that's of course still in the future plans. And basically, this way it can be done. This way the judgments are done for each option. Naturally, before I judge anything, I need to complete the research evidence so that I have something to judge, and I can do it in a number of ways, as in regular EtD. So I can paste, I can write here the evidence, I can insert images, I can insert tables from elsewhere in the project. So that's all I can do, and let me show you a completed version of such EtD, what it can look like. So as I mentioned, there can be text, there can be tables inserted, both regular pairwise comparison tables and the network meta-analysis tables, and that's how it can be completed. What is also important to note here is that as I go further into the EtD, I come across criteria that require me to go back to the previous ones. So, for example, net balance that Jessica mentioned. To assess net balance, I have to know what was the judgment for desirable effects and undesirable effects. And to make that easier, when I do the judgment in GRADEpro, I can see my previous judgments for both desirable effects and undesirable effects for all the interventions. And looking at those, I can see whether there's no net balance or perhaps a small net desirable effects based on my previous judgments. And this goes for all. So, for example, when it comes to balance of effects, which according to GRADE should take into account both benefits and harms, but also certainty of evidence and patients' values, I see all of those criteria listed based on how I voted, how I judged them beforehand, so that it's easier for me to make the overall judgment based on all the previous judgments I did. So that's quite useful. you may have heard that instead of judged, I said voted. This is because, of course, as all the ETDs in GRADEpro, the multiple intervention ETD also supports panel voice. So I can send an online survey based on that multiple intervention ETD to a panel of experts who will vote on it. And this way I can, for example, survey their opinions before a guideline group meeting. And what it looks like is, of course, those are sent from the panel voice feature panel voice module in GRADEpro. I can see the multiple intervention questions here as well, and I can send those for voting. I will not go into detail of sending it. We did a separate webinar on the panel voice, which you can also view on our YouTube channel. But once it is sent, what the panel members see is a rendition of the multiple intervention ETD with the same content as it's entered in GRADEpro, but they can make the votes, the judgments on their own. And for the criteria, when you judge each intervention separately, they can select for each intervention a different judgment. And also, as in GRADEpro, once they judge, for example, the desirable effects and undesirable effects for interventions, when they go further and they have to judge net balance, they will be presented an automatic table that shows what's here. So, for example, as you can see, long-acting insulin is not yet here, but once I judge desirable effects and the undesirable effects for long-acting insulin, it will appear here, and it appears as the panelists judge it, so it can be easier for them to judge it this way. This is of course complex, so if you want to narrow it down for the panel members, you can also use a version of the voting where you just propose the judgment for panel members, and they just mark whether they agree or disagree with the proposed judgment based on the evidence. And if they disagree, the comment field becomes compulsory, so they must tell you why they disagree with that particular judgment. And once the votes are in, you can view them in GRADEpro. So they are presented as a table, because otherwise it would be very hard to present a number of different judgments for a number of different interventions. Across the panel, you can see the summary of votes in the table, but you can also sort by particular panelists if you want to sort them out, or you can change it to percentage if it's easier to see. So that's another feature of GRADEpro that is incorporated into this multiple intervention approach. Additionally, of course, as any table in GRADEpro, it can be exported outside GRADEpro, so you can, for example, paste it into a document of your guideline. And additionally, it comes into the suite of multiple intervention solutions that we are currently offering. So, as I mentioned, the evidence from multiple intervention ETD can be supported by network meta-analysis evidence that was presented in previous webinar by my colleague Bart. And then in the next part, the evidence from the assessed evidence and the recommendation that is made in the multiple intervention ETD can then be used to create a visual clinical guideline, which is a one-page presentation of evidence, of multiple evidence, which then in turn will be presented during future GRADEpro webinars. I mentioned recommendations. Naturally, at the end of the process, once the judgments are made, you see the summary of all judgments. As Jessica mentioned, you can also assign importance of decision for different criteria to make it easier to decide which are more relevant for decision and which ones are not. And you can select, you can make a different recommendation for each of the interventions presented. And also you can also choose not to make a recommendation if there's not enough evidence. So that's where here you can select the strength and direction of the recommendation. But in the next step, you can add recommendations. I have a completed example further here. So, for example, you can add different recommendations for different interventions of particular from the particular question, and assign them, for example, different strengths of recommendations. So it can even be that for once it's against, and for others it's for. Itzi will certainly tell about this in more detail. In the end, this is all to support the guideline development process. So I hope this feature it will prove to be helpful for more teams. And in this case, I will pass the mic to Itzi, who will show you a practical example. And if there are any questions at the end, I will be more than happy to address them.
Okay, let me try to share. I just see a question in the chat asking whether there is an option to not only provide multiple comparisons against the common comparator, but also head-to-head comparison. And yes, there is, and I will show it. Can you tell me if you can see my screen?
Yes.
So what we wanted to show here was a real example how we use the multiple comparison ETDs in this ACP guideline that was published last year. It is on newer pharmacological treatment in adults with type 2 diabetes. This clinical guideline was performed by the ACP Center at Minnesota, and they performed, so the guideline was an ACP guideline and was informed but by an evidence, a systematic review and a network meta-analysis performed by the Evidence Center of Review at Minnesota. We use the EtD frameworks, and together with the publication, we published this supplemental material with all the ETDs, multiple comparison ETDs that we use to formulate recommendations during the development of the guideline, so that all the judgments and everything was transparently published together with the guideline. By the time we did the guideline, this summary of evidence tables, we needed to develop them manually. At that time, we were working with evidence primes. I didn't know whether we will show in this workshop how to do that. I think that there are other specific workshops where you can see how to use the program in order to develop this specific summary of evidence tables of multiple intervention. As you can see here, this could be multiple interventions against or compared with usual care or placebo. We have here the multiple interventions. We have here the outcomes that we are considering. I just wanted to say that nowadays you are able to prepare this in the GRADEpro. What we were able to use was the multiple comparison ETD. We were able to set the multiple comparison ETD and send through the panel voice, as Justina saw, to the panel members. The panel members will receive this panel voice and individually will go through all criteria considered in the ETD, as Justina also mentioned. These criteria might be flexible. Different groups might be using different criteria. In this specific guideline, we use those criteria. I am showing here the final summary of these judgments that Jessica showed, but I will go to the program, to the project, to show you how we did this. So in this specific multiple comparison EtD framework, we set up in a way that we were able to show all the intervention of interest. In this case, those are drug classes rather than individual interventions, but the drug classes of interest, but this could be always against placebo. What we don't need to, we need to consider that we will be always doing the relative assessment of two interventions, the relative assessment. So we will be always comparing one against the other. What we need to think when we prepare this EtD is that the specific judgments that we do across all individual criteria, not the specific judgments, but the specific comparison will be the same across all criteria. We will be judging in this criteria DPP-4 against placebo, GLP-1 against placebo. So in the way that the panel members, they received this EtD that we prepared, we completed the research evidence section with the information they needed to assess and make the judgments for. And in the judgments, they will be doing the same judgments you do when you have a single pairwise comparison, because you do the judgment here in this piece, DPP-4 against placebo, then GLP-1 against placebo, but simultaneously for many interventions. So they will receive they will go one by one doing judgments for the same comparison across all judgments. And at the end of the day, the program will support the panels with the summary of all these judgments, which is better to integrate in a way and get a final conclusion about the relative importance of different interventions each other. In this specific case, we can see, or the panel judged, that there was a high certainty evidence for 3 of the drug classes. DPP-4 inhibitors didn't show any net effect. It was no clinically meaningful desirable or undesirable effect. So the panel judged that there was that the balance didn't favor either the intervention or the comparison. In this case, the usual care. It was a very costly, there were very costly drugs. Same for GLP-1 agonist and SGLT2 inhibitors, very costly drugs, but with high certainty of evidence. They judged that the desirable effect were moderate and with no clinically relevant differences against placebo in undesirable effects. Therefore, they were able to formulate 2 recommendations, 2 big recommendations or clusters, as showed Jessica before. One was against the intervention who didn't show a net benefit, and the other one was favoring the use of the intervention that saw some net benefit. Both of them with a strong recommendation because they were of high certainty. However, at this point, panel members wanted to go further in order to see whether one could be recommended over the other, or whether it could be prioritized. Here, when comparing the different judgments across these specific ones, everything was similar. So they didn't have further information in order to allow this prioritization. However, I'm sorry, however, since in this case we have a network meta-analysis performed by the Center of Evidence Review, we do have this information about the relative effect when one was compared against the other. And the panel assessed this information. Now, for that question that was in the chat, I will show very quickly how we work around in order to be able, as you can see here, to prepare this head-to-head comparison, that they are not against they are not using the common comparator. And if you can see here, we are using a common intervention. We wanted to see how GLP-1 performed compared with all the others. However, what I want to show you here is that this is something that the methodologies need to think about, and that is customizable. And this is how you will think about that. And in order to prepare this, in this case, I'm coming here and I need to add the multiple comparison questions. As Justina said, we arrive here, we address the question. Here, we don't have many intervention against a common comparator, but we are able to address the way that we work around was preparing these EtD tables, writing down the comparison of your interest. So here you can write as you wish. Let's do it another one. And then you complete everything, you have all this created, and here you have the comparison of interest. So this will be the way to work around in order to be able to present the data that you want to present. And in this case, it was the relative effect between GLP-1 and SGLT2. In this case, we completed. Here they have the information. They went through the judgment process, and they arrived to these conclusions where everything was very similar. There were not relevant differences, and the balance of effect as a conclusion, they concluded that probably does not favor either intervention or the comparison. As such, they wouldn't be able to prioritize, in this case, one over the other, but they were able to add some specification of who will be the population that will most benefit from all this. So with this, and in order to conclude, we wanted to show with this example that the EtD framework are transparent, flexible, and structured frameworks that facilitates the decision-making, putting all this complex information in a simple way, that it is flexible because you can choose what relevant information is the one that we need to report for decision making, and you can adapt to different scenarios, as Jessica shows, where we have a common comparator with an NMA, when we have a common comparator through different systematic reviews, or when we don't even have a common comparator, but we have different systematic reviews. It is worth to mention that in the latest two scenarios when we don't have an NMA, it is extremely important to consider population intervention differences across different comparisons, because you didn't achieve or assume the transitivity, no risk of transitivity issues as you do when you have a network meta-analysis. And finally, if evidence is appropriate, it also allows, because of the way it is structured, to prioritize recommendations. Thank you very much. I finished my presentation. And I give the floor to Christy, I think.
Thank you, Itziar and Jessica and Justina, for your presentations. We've now moved over to the questions and answer section of the webinar. Feel free to ask any of the questions that you may have by making use of the Q&A section at the bottom of the webinar. I did see that we had some questions come in, as well as Jessica answering those questions. So Jessica, if it's okay, I know that you have already typed these answers in, but if you could just take us through the answers as well on the webinar, that would be great. So the first question, or I see the one that you're working on at the moment. So we have interventions are evaluated in conjunction, which means the outcomes we can find be attributed to how all of them work together. How can we decide the grading of each?
Okay, so first of all, we have to determine outcome importance. To do this, you can use unstructured, let's say, ways like making a survey to the panel and asking regarding the outcome's importance, or you can even do a systematic review and incorporate health utilities to assess your outcome's importance. Once you have this, you can calculate, or you can determine, the magnitude of effect thresholds. The thresholds will also incorporate utility values. So whenever you make a judgment about the magnitude of how desirable or how undesirable are these effects, because you are using the thresholds, you are implicitly making a difference of the outcome importance of these among outcomes. So in that way, when you make the judgment, you know which outcome is, the final interpretation will implicitly, you will implicitly know the difference of importance of the outcome and the effect. Okay, so this is something that comes in conjunction. So that's why you can do it easily. And then I can finish typing the answer so it's more clear.
Thank you so much. And then another question that we had was, how can I present the results from a multi-intervention ETD?
Okay, so the results, you can, what I answer is that to summarize all your judgments, the panel may choose to use the original ETD labels, like for example, it favors or probably favors the intervention, or they can use graphical formats like the stars, like a 5-star system, 3-star system, as they have used before. Or both of these alternatives may coexist, or they can use alternative labelings, such as first-line interventions, second-line interventions, and in this way, they can describe the results. If that's how far we've come with the presentation of results.
Okay, great.
I also wanted to chime in, like from the, let's say, technical perspective. So what Jessica said is the decisions you make with the panel. We also offer tools for that. So if I can share my screen for a second, this will, yeah. So as I mentioned, the ETD can be exported. So you can, in the end, once you made all the decisions with the panel, you can export. You can decide which parts you want to export, whether you want to include the voting results, if there was a voting done for this particular ETD. You can also attach images as appendix, and in the end you can export to formats such as HTML, MS Word, and PDF. So I will do a Word export now, and don't be alarmed with the color. I'm using it black to spare the eyes, but in the end, it's the same. It's the same table that we did in GRADEpro, including all the content that was entered inside. And here you can, of course, as in any Word, you can make any edits that you may want to. And additionally, there's the module I mentioned, so visual clinical guidelines. So it will be presented in detail further on, but this particular recommendation that we presented today was also presented in this format, meaning that the decisions from the ETD, their recommendations are presented in a visual manner together with clinical considerations and citations, and then the evidence for particular pairs of interventions and comparisons can be accessed on the plot. So that's also another option of visualization that is available for those results. So basically, that's what you want to make it.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Few more questions that we have. I think I'm not too sure, Jessica, if you'll be able to describe thresholds in a little bit more detail.
Well, this is actually outside of the scope of this webinar, but what I can tell you is that there's a recent publication in the Annals of Internal Medicine describing all the methods in detail to determine the thresholds. And I think it's better if you read it more than I tell it right now. I might be more confusing than helpful. But I can tell you that this is a hot press and you can read it there. But actually, it's very simple. It's just using the utilities to determine different magnitude of effect thresholds, like from trivial, small, moderate, and large, in order to categorize your effects. Itzi, you may want to add anything.
No, I don't want to add anything. Maybe the link to the publication. I will try to get the link. Nothing.
Thank you so much. And another question we have here, I saw that in many aspects of the GRADE and EtD, we can decide on aspects of each intervention. However, if I do not know which specific intervention that is part of the multi-component intervention I can attribute the results to, how do I fill in those, I want to say, gaps or camps?
I mean, I'm not sure about what if this multi-component intervention is the same as what we are trying to describe now, because as far as I understand, maybe I'm not understanding well the question, and please interrupt me if you think I'm wrong, but we are saying here, if we, for example, for diabetes, if we have more than one intervention, right? Like the GPL1 or etc. But then the multi-component intervention is when we have many components that add together or that are given together to a subject for the intervention, right? Like, for example, I don't know, an exercise intervention plus the diabetic medication, right? So this requires, as far as I know, a different kind of analysis. That is, for example, a multi-component network meta-analysis. And this goes beyond what we have try to accomplish in this framework, which is as far as multiple individual interventions.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yes, Justina.
Yeah, also to add, because I also, again, I'm not sure if I got it correctly, but it seemed from this question and from another one, which now I cannot recall, that the idea was that since it's a multiple intervention EtD, it means that although we are using all those interventions at once and assessing their effect, this is not the case. The framework serves for comparing multiple interventions use as single interventions against one another and determining, for example, which one we have 5 interventions, A, B, C, D, E, and we want to assess which one works best for this particular condition, or perhaps there are 2 that work best. And we're not thinking of a case when we used all of them together at once and see what are the effects. We are looking at them still as separate interventions, just comparing them simultaneously, because otherwise you would have to make a series of pairwise comparisons, which is, well, could yield the same result, but would be more time consuming, I guess.
Great, thank you so much. And then Itziar, I see that you kind of already answered this question within the Q&A section, but somebody did ask, can the summary table with the absolute effects be created automatically by GRADEpro, merging the different evidence profiles for the different comparisons, or the summary table for desirable and undesirable need to be created outside of GRADEpro by the systematic review team, and then copy and paste it into the multi-comparison EtD?
I did answer, but maybe it's Justina better to answer this. I did answer that currently we are able to develop this summary findings table in the GRADEpro. But Justina, please.
So if the question is, can we make a summary of findings in GRADEpro, then of course the answer is yes. But if I understand correctly, the question here could, if I understand correctly, the question could be if you have a series of pairwise comparison tables and you want to merge them into an NMA table. So at the moment, it is not possible. You create network meta-analysis tables by importing results from outside analytical programs such as R, which is still automatic and you don't have to do it manually, but it's not essentially merging multi-pairwise tables into one. I'm not sure if this is a very technical question, very hard to answer in such webinar, but I think rather than merging multiple pairwise tables into a single table, we would rather support, as I mentioned before, creating an EtD which is a multiple intervention EtD, but bases information on multiple pairwise tables, for example, with no need to merge them into a single one.
Yes, I do see the benefit of that, which is presenting all the intervention of interest together at once, rather than going as we used to do previously, one by one. So at the end, it's more difficult to do an overall assessment of the best ones. Nowadays, me as a methodologist, if I know that the decision-making process it will be done at the multiple intervention level, I will directly go to the summary of findings table where you can put what are your intervention or comparison of interest and complete that one rather than the single one and then try to merge them. At the end of the day, this facilitates having in a table all this if your final objective is to present all of them. So I will avoid to do that step directly. I will go to the summary of findings table. There is a feature that allows to import to the GRADEpro system information, this information from statistical programs. So from R, you can import the estimates and so on, and then you can do the grading and everything using the program as we usually do with single pairwise comparison that you are able to import from Redman. In this case, is from statistical analysis. So this is a huge advance if you need to type rather than manually doing for multiple interventions. This is automatic way to do that, and it saves so much time.
Yeah, sure, of course. So also the general answer is whenever we can see option to automate and make life and work easier, we do it, and wherever the methodology goes, we go. So that's the order it goes in.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. We are rapidly approaching the end of the hour here. So I'd like to thank all of our presenters once again, Justina, Itziar, and Justina. And thank you to everybody that attended today's webinar. Please do visit our website and follow us on social media. If you do have any questions with regards to the topics discussed in today's webinar or about GRADEpro, the tool, you can reach out to us at support@gradepro.org. Or if you're interested in purchasing GRADEpro or making use of GRADEpro, you can reach out to sales@evidenceprime.com. So yes, thank you again, everybody, for your time and for joining us today.